As science advanced during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution changed the way people worked and organized their lives. It also changed the way they looked at the world. A new generation of philosophers soon began to challenge Kant's theories. Whilst they accepted the idealism, they were dissatisfied with the limits he put on understanding and reason, and so sought to transform his idealism. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in Stuttgart in 1770 and studied at the University of Tübingen. Much of his writing is complicated and is difficult both to understand and to expound. He published his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in 1817, and further expanded editions followed in 1827 and 1830. The encyclopedia is a hugely ambitious work. Its aim is to take in the whole of reality, history, and knowledge in a systematic form.
Well, the encyclopedia, published in 1830, the third edition, comes in 3 parts, and then 3 books. First, it's called The Logic, and then A Philosophy of Nature, and A Philosophy of Mind or Spirit. And the idea all along, I think, is to develop a system of a way of thinking that will resolve problems in the natural world, in the way science treats the world, and in the human world, politically and ethically and so on, by using the categories that he set out in the Logic.
There is much in the encyclopedia that is influenced by Aristotle. Hegel was both a rationalist and a romantic. He had a keen sense of how the past affects the present. He claimed to have produced a complete map of all possible knowledge and reality. Hegel saw medieval Christianity as a prime example of what he called the unhappy consciousness. Judaism emphasized the separation between man and God. Christianity sought to unite man and God through the incarnation. Yet there is still a gap between the changing nature of the world and the unchanging nature of God.
He wants to integrate religion within philosophy. And the way he does it is to argue that basically the insights of religion are the same as the insights of philosophy, but just expressed or understood in religious terms. So he just characterizes it as picture thinking, thinking in terms of images or representations. So religion will talk about God, and will talk about the incarnation, will talk about creation and so on. And he thinks they're all legitimate ways of thinking about the world in a pictorial or story form. And philosophy is able to recast those ideas in more philosophical forms. So, for example, religion talks about the incarnation, or religion talks about creation as God creating the world. Well, what does that mean philosophically? Well, it means that there's a sort of rational structure inherent in things. And when we talk about God creating the world, we just mean, well, in sort of Einstein phrase, God doesn't play dice. Well, what does that mean? Well, we just mean that the world has a rational order. It's no accident, in some sense, that things, broadly speaking, are as they are. We can understand why things have to be a certain way. And that relates to the religious idea of God and God's creation and so on. So Hegel hoped that he could satisfy or give a place for religion in that way within a philosophical framework.
Hegel goes on to deal with reason and what he calls spirit, while contrasting the ancient world with the modern world.
what he means by spirit is a particular way in which consciousness, or consciousness of a people or a community or a period, is then at home in the world. So he talks, for example, about the Greeks as ever-present spirit. And the reason he talks about the Greeks there is that he has a picture of the Greeks as having this integrated view of the world, at home in the world, such that they didn't seem to suffer from the various problems and tensions of the modern world. So spirit, what he calls spirit, was realised in some sense with the Greeks, was apparent in the Greeks, because they had this kind of unity with the world. Hegel's view is that for a variety of reasons, that at-homeness, that spirit of that period was lost. And that's really because he tends to treat the Greeks as a kind of childhood of human consciousness. So much like a child has a certain kind of happy relationship to the world, again supposedly, before all the anxieties of adolescence set in. So the Greeks had a sort of simple, straightforward, but rather naive view of the world. They saw it as rational, they saw themselves as integrated within their communities and so on. We don't have that anymore. Ours is a more anxious time. We have all these tensions. We're not so convinced that the world is a hospitable and place at which we can be at home. But then he hoped that spirit, as it were, would return. This kind of integrated picture would return when these problems of modern consciousness could be resolved.
In Philosophy of Right, Hegel deals with social ethics and the state. His claim that the rational is the actual has led critics to claim that he wrote the book as an apology for the authoritarian Prussian state under which he lived, and that as a result he should be seen as an influence on Nazism.
It's not clear, again, it's not obvious that Hegel was a reactionary figure, but in historical terms. But I think also you can think of the question philosophically. I mean, again, Hegel, as usual, is trying to strike a balance. So he does want, as I say, the individual to feel integrated within the state. It's not that he wants to get rid of any notions of individuality. But obviously that means that it can seem as if he nonetheless, because he wants to integrate the individual, he wants to still place some limits on the ways in which the individual can criticize the state or step outside the state. Now even here, it's not clear that Hegel's saying the individual should always obey the state or should always feel at home with the state, should always accept the decisions the state should make, because again he draws a contrast between the rational state, the state where there are proper mechanisms for dealing with individual interests and balancing them off against each other, and the non-rational state. So he does talk about figures in history, such as Socrates and Christ and so on, who were in a sense rebelling against the state of their time. And he sees that as perfectly legitimate because they're not living within the rational state. So it's only if the political conditions are right, as it were, that Hegel thinks the individual should by and large go along with the decisions the states are making.
No philosopher since Hegel has laid claim to the same kind of comprehensiveness and universality of thought.
Up until maybe 20 years ago or so, Hegel was a very marginal figure. People tended to read, study up to Kant, and then they would sort of leap from Kant to Frege or something of that sort. And Hegel would be just this sort of dark period where it all became obscure and difficult and bizarre, and nobody thought it should be taken particularly seriously. And it's more like as if somebody read Plato without reading Aristotle. If you read Kant and then don't bother to read Hegel, you're missing out on a whole range of important developments, and not just Hegel, other post-Kantian idealists like Schelling and Fichte as well. You're missing out on a whole range of developments that can appear very obscure and difficult and peculiar when you first look at them, but actually tap into rather deep and interesting issues that we're only now, I think, within the analytic tradition beginning to rediscover.
The main characteristic of Schopenhauer's writing is its elegance and clarity. In 1819, he published his main work, The World as Will and Representation. 6 years earlier, he had produced his doctoral dissertation, The Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. He believed this should be read as an introduction to his main work. He claimed his philosophy was the unfolding of a single thought and acknowledged a great debt to Kant. Schopenhauer set out 4 forms of the principle of sufficient reason. One of Schopenhauer's important contributions to philosophy was his work on the world as will. The world as we experience it, according to Schopenhauer, has the character of will. This does not mean will in the way perhaps understood today, but the raw energy of the universe. Schopenhauer means will in terms of stars exploding, cooling, galaxies expanding and contracting. This phenomenon has no consciousness or personality. In the third part of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer considers art and what he construes as Platonic ideas. Schopenhauer dismissed the ideas of God and the soul. For this reason, he has been accused of being the most pessimistic among German philosophers. But this is perhaps unfair. Schopenhauer pinpoints music, sculpture, poetry, and the arts generally as the portal into the world that would otherwise be beyond our reach. This is because, whilst enveloping ourselves in art, especially music, we escape the shackles of time and space, even our physical selves. Born in Prussia in 1844, Nietzsche studied classical philology at Bonn and Leipzig universities. At the age of 24, he was awarded a professorship at the University of Basel, something very unusual for the time. His life was, however, plagued by illness, and in 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental breakdown and spent the last 11 years of his life being cared for by his sister. One of Nietzsche's main assertions was that traditional Judeo-Christian values had lost their meaning for many people. They were formed long ago by societies much different to our own. He recognized that religion was playing a far less important role than it used to. He was convinced that traditional values represented a slave morality. That is, a morality created by weak people who encourage kindness and similar traits because such behavior served their interests. Once we break down our existing morality, Nietzsche claims, we can pursue our own destiny untrammeled and realize our true potential. Nietzsche often refers to this unleashing of possibilities as daring to be imaginative, innovative, courageous, and so on. This unleashing of one's potential was coined by Nietzsche as the will to power. And as there is no afterlife, no God, no reason to restrain our capacities or talents, and that we are masters of our own destinies, Nietzsche claimed we should live our lives for their own sakes. As if lives are works of art, as it were. For this reason, he has a kind of aesthetic understanding of life, although his vision of life is far from picturesque.
The life-affirming. And in a sense, the notion of health is really important to him. But health is not stasis, it's not a kind of stable state. It's a kind of warding off of disease. And because for Nietzsche, even the self isn't a unity, there's a kind of potential difference within what we think of as the unified self. The self is only a unity insofar as all the different forces within you and energies within you might tend temporarily in the same direction. So the will to power is not power over another. It's a will to a kind of energic will where all the energies are directed towards the same end and he says things like, "Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And the will to power is used to explain digestion, eating, reproduction, and the will to find truths. Now, he's not offering the will to power as a truth. The will to power is yet another interpretation of the world. It's that it's a more life-affirming one.
During his lifetime, Nietzsche produced an influential body of work. Both Mussolini and Hitler read Nietzsche extensively. The Nazis extracted quotes from Nietzsche's work to use in their propaganda, and for some years after their demise, their link with the philosopher's work overshadowed his impressive contribution to philosophy. Nietzsche was not a Nazi, but his work reverberated throughout the artistic and cultural world, inspiring playwrights, poets, and composers.
When Nietzsche went mad towards the end of his life, Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, who was married to one of the most celebrated anti-Semites in Germany, took Nietzsche and sort of made a sort of fetish of him almost. You know, he was there and people would come and visit him. And she also took his unpublished notebooks, the so-called Will to Power, and edited them, and his other works as well, in a way that made him look like an anti-Semite. And it was possible to do this because Nietzsche writes metaphorically. He's also not writing for the common man. He's writing for the man who's out of his time, who knows his work, who will not read him literally. So there is a certain responsibility in terms of the way that Nietzsche wrote. He knew that he could be read anti-Semitically. He said it made him sick. He said it made him laugh. He said it was a gross distortion of his work. But at the same time, he still wrote in a way where it was possible to read him like that. But really, it's to do with his sister, primarily, I think, that his work was given such an extraordinary weight by the Nazis, and the Nazis weighted Wagner and Nietzsche almost together.
Marx was born in Trier in 1818 and initially studied law. He soon turned his attention to philosophy and, for a time, edited a newspaper in Cologne. It was when he moved to Paris that he met Friedrich Engels, and in 1848 they wrote the Communist Manifesto. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. In his youth, Marx had belonged to a radical political group called the Young Hegelians, but later became disenchanted with Hegel's philosophy.
In a sense, Marx doesn't disagree with Hegel's project, that you know, the aim is to create a society of a kind of harmonious society where people are integrated and feel part of a community and so on. But Marx thinks that Hegel is rather naive and optimistic in how Hegel thinks that's going to be brought about. So, for example, Hegel thinks that treats the bureaucracy as what Hegel calls a universal class. So the bureaucracy is meant to have this rather worthy concern with the well-being of the community as a whole, and that's the role of the bureaucracy within the community, that they're sort of there to make sure that everyone's interests are treated equally and fairly and so on. And Marx is just contemptuous about this and just sees the bureaucracy as a rather corrupt institution which is in the service of the monarch or whatever, and certainly isn't this rather benign, idealised part of the community that Hegel thought of.
Today, Marxism is unfashionable. Capitalism has conquered the globe. Yet his contribution to political philosophy can't be ignored.
One influence, I think, is in terms of his theory of justice, as we might call it now. Because again, it's a contentious issue within Marx whether he had a theory of justice, whether Marx was just a social scientist, just trying to understand why societies change and develop and perhaps where they're going to go, but he wasn't interested in making judgments about whether one society is better than another or more just than another. And they, you can certainly find passages where he's critical of those notions. They shouldn't be of concern to good communist thinkers who shouldn't be going around judging societies in that way.
Only the truth that edifies is the truth for you. Søren Kierkegaard is generally seen as the founder of existentialism. In 1840, he was about to marry, but broke off his engagement, feeling it was incompatible with his calling as a philosopher. He was an intensely religious man, and felt the Danish church had distorted Christ's message.
One of the things that the church does is disguise to people the paradoxicality. They make Christianity sound, the church makes Christianity sound too easy, too comfortable, too ethical. So, for example, in Fear and Trembling, he is writing about Abraham as the father of faith, and he takes the story from Genesis where God commands Abraham to take Isaac, his son, up Mount Moriah and kill him. And Abraham doesn't know that at the last moment God will provide a lamb or a ram as a sacrifice instead of his son. And he says that we might go to church and hear a preacher talking about how we should honour Abraham as the father of faith, etc., without focusing on the fact that this was a would-be murderer. If a preacher told the story of Abraham in the church, then Kierkegaard indicates that the preacher would also be horrified if any member of the congregation went home and on the basis of a message from God actually went out and murdered his son.
The dominant theme of Kierkegaard's work is man's relationship with God, and here he disagreed sharply with Hegel.
For Kierkegaard, there is no synthesis. There are different modes and ways of life, and we have to choose between the different modes. And it's not that religion or faith involves a synthesis of other previous stages. It's a different mode and is irreconcilably different. Hegel also thinks of the state in terms of Christianity. So he's in favour of sort of state forms of Christianity. He thinks of Christianity as tied to reason, and he thinks of this gradual progression of the spirit. And Hegel is different from Kierkegaard in respect to all these things.
In Either Or, Kierkegaard argues that we have a choice between two ways of living, the aesthetic and the ethical.
Kierkegaard is concerned with, so to speak, seducing the reader, so presenting the reader with choices in such a way that the reader has to choose what sort of self to become, whether to become an aesthetic and ethical or religious type self. And it's almost as if there are parallel possibilities, parallel universes almost, and that at any moment in time there are these different possible paths or routes that one might follow, and through choice turn oneself into a different kind of self. But it's not that we know in advance what sort of self we are, so that the choices are made freely. But on the other hand, Kierkegaard is developing a notion of a self in which the self only ever exists in relation to another. And so it's not a completely autonomous self, it's a self that's guided. And because the reader has to make their own choice, so to speak, Kierkegaard's very concerned with indirect communication, not giving or the answer himself, but leading the reader to the point at which they can see what the choices are.
Kierkegaard's Christianity is a very Protestant one. His key notion is that of angst, or dread, resulting from a life given over to the senses. Kierkegaard believed in subjective thinking. The source for truth is personal. A person's choices and decisions are between him and God. It was this emphasis on individual choice that was to influence future philosophers. There is no worse lie than a truth misunderstood by those who hear it. Pragmatism was a reaction amongst American philosophers against idealism. The leading lights of the movement were William James and C.S. Peirce.
Pragmatism was a philosophical movement that emerged in the United States, predominantly around Harvard, in the 1860s, 1870s, and the years following. I think it originated in a metaphysical club, as Peirce called it, that he and James belonged to in Harvard in the early 1870s. It contained them, some other philosophers, and significantly, I think, some lawyers.
It was Peirce who emphasized the practical bearing we conceive the object of our conception to have. This idea, which Peirce called pragmatism, was taken over by James.
For Peirce, pragmatism was a kind of tool for clarifying the contents of our ideas and hypotheses and things we're interested in. And I suppose one thing he hoped that he'd get from it was a demonstration that lots of ideas and hypotheses were actually empty. They didn't need to be dealt with. And in particular, a lot of the traditional questions of philosophy could be dismissed by showing to be meaningless.
James, however, applied the idea to truth itself. James believed consciousness to be like a river and invented the term stream of thought. In his Principles of Psychology, he puts forward 5 principles concerning consciousness.
The first of these was that our thoughts tend to cluster into personal consciousnesses, which roughly means that, if there's a thought, it's my thought or it's your thought, and lots of thoughts are connected just through being in the same mind, through being mine or through being yours. His second claim was that within any consciousness, thought is always changing. There's a kind of continual process of one thought following another, giving away to another. And I guess you don't find periods of sort of stasis where nothing much is going on. The third claim was that thought is continuous. So I suppose that means that there's not just one thought followed by another thought followed by another thought. There's a kind of continuous process whereby thoughts evolve and develop. The fourth claim, again pretty plausible, is that most of our thoughts present themselves as about external things. So that James might have been thinking about Harvard University or about his friend Charles Peirce. And so if we're going to understand how thoughts work, we have to understand how they can be about these independently existing things. Okay. But finally, James emphasized that in our thought, when we're thinking about things, we're always attending to or focusing on particular features of them. So I'm not just thinking about Harvard University. I might be thinking of Memorial Hall or thinking about the green in the center of the university or something of that kind. So we need to understand how thought can be selective in the way in which it attends to things.
Meanwhile, in France, Henri Bergson was a great influence on William James. He is perhaps best known for coining the phrase, the vital spirit.
Bergson was a philosopher who took evolution very seriously. I think he'd probably been influenced by Darwin's writings, but he rejected the sort of mechanistic basis for evolution that Darwin offered. Indeed, he wanted to think that evolution did involve some kind of progress, that through time things were getting better, whereas the Darwinian story doesn't allow for that possibility at all. So he claimed that evolution was in a way driven by a sort of creative urge or a vital spirit, which was a kind of explanatory principle, I suppose, that would have no place in mechanistic physical accounts of how the world works. I think he thought that the same process was actually present to us in our consciousness, in the way in which we make decisions, because we were aware of the ways in which our choices are influenced by memories, influenced by the past. But we're also aware, he thought, that they're not determined by the memories, that we are actually free to choose, and indeed free to make things better. So either way, this reference to progress gives us a rather optimistic view of things, optimism about what we can do, and also optimism about the way things are going. But it's interesting that it carries with it a commitment to a sort of vital spirit, an explanatory principle that has no place in the physical sciences or anything of that sort. So it carries with it the thought that in explaining living things, in biology and in psychology and so on, we have to appeal to, well, a doctrine that's often called vitalism, the thought that there is this vital spirit there as an additional explanatory mechanism.
In creative evolution, Bergson says the whole universe must be seen in historical terms. Every stage is a development of what has gone before. The present contains nothing more than the past, and what is found in the effect was already in the cause. Ludwig Wittgenstein was born in Vienna in 1889, but became a naturalized British citizen. He initially trained as an engineer, but from 1912 to 1913, he studied mathematical logic under Russell. Like Russell, Wittgenstein was interested in language and its uses. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world.
What Wittgenstein's interested in is ordinary language, the kind of language that we use all the time, not some ideal equivalent that philosophers may be able to set up.
In later life, Wittgenstein became disillusioned with some of the theories he had propounded in the Tractatus.
You get the impression when you're reading the Tractatus that it's as if he thinks that the only basic linguistic move that's of any concern is the move of saying what things are like, saying what is the case, to go back to the very first sentence of the Tractatus. And of course that is something that we often do. We give each other information, we pass on information to each other in all sorts of ways, and we can be right or wrong as the case may be. If you ask me for instructions to get to somewhere, I can give you directions, and those directions may be correct or incorrect as the case may be. But he later began to realise that that's by no means all that we do with language. There are all sorts of other things that we do as well as just convey information. We greet one another, we thank one another, we praise each other and blame each other for various things. A whole variety of different linguistic moves that we make that hadn't really been recognised in the earlier work, or so he later thought.
Wittgenstein's views began to change in later life. It is only since his death in 1951 that much of this has come to light. Many of his texts and lectures were published posthumously. These included the Blue and Brown books, typescript copies of lectures he gave at Cambridge. Their influence was significant. In Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein deals with language and numbers. He begins with what he calls language games.
When Wittgenstein in his later work talks about language games, really this is a metaphor for helping us to understand the variety of different things that we can do with language other than just talk about what is the case or convey information to each other. So when people greet each other in the street and say hi or hello or how are you, for Wittgenstein they're playing a kind of language game. They're making moves in a game which don't consist in conveying information. When you say hi, you're not conveying information to another person, you're greeting them. And the other example that I mentioned earlier was thanking. Somebody gives you something and you express your thanks. Again, that's not a way of conveying information. That's a particular kind of move that we sometimes make in a very important language game that we sometimes play. The point is simply to remind us of the huge variety of different things that we can do with language.
He also deals with rules for the development of series, such as that of numbers.
Wittgenstein was very interested in the whole question of rules and following rules in his later philosophy, although I think perhaps people have sometimes exaggerated his interest because they've thought that what he was claiming was that language is always governed by precise rules, which actually, it seems to me, is in direct violation of the point that we were just making. It's not always governed in very precise ways by precise rules, and there are plenty of linguistic games that develop in a rather unregulated way.
For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus. The meaning of a word is its use in language. Perhaps the most controversial section of the book is that dealing with the naming of sensations. It has been seen as a revolt against the Cartesian framework.
On the Cartesian view, it's as if there's a little private theatre that we each carry around with us, and that we're observing what's going on that private stage. And Wittgenstein says, well, the reason that we think like that is that we're once again forgetting the huge variety of different ways in which language can function. So that, to take one very simple example, think about the claim, I'm in pain. Suppose that you're asking me whether a part of my body hurts or not, and I say, yes, I am feeling some pain at the moment, or yes, it does hurt, or whatever. We're inclined to think, as Wittgenstein himself perhaps would have thought when he wrote the Tractatus, that what this is a commentary on what the world is like, that it's a way of conveying information in the same way that I might tell you that there's a chair over there. I'm now telling you that there's a pain in my leg. And the question then arises, okay, what's the nature of this information that I'm conveying? What am I commenting on? What am I reporting on? And once you raise that question, it's then not very long before you're going to be starting to think about this in Cartesian terms. Think, well, the pain is something that only I have access to, so when I'm telling you that I'm in pain, obviously that's something that I can know in a way that you can't. It must be because I'm talking about this little private world that I carry around with me. And Wittgenstein says, well, no, we're forgetting that language does function in a huge variety of ways. And although I'm in pain is a little bit like there's a chair over there, in other ways it's very unlike that. And we could just as well think of it on the model of simply saying ouch, which is another linguistic way in which people react to pain, a much more simple, much more primitive linguistic reaction to pain. But nevertheless, that's part of the language that children have to learn. And that's one of the ways in which, when children are in pain, they do react to their pain. So Wittgenstein says, well, if we think of it more like that, we'll begin to resist some of those Cartesian temptations. We'll begin to wonder about whether it even makes sense to say that I can know that I'm in pain in a way that you can't.
Wittgenstein believed it was necessary that language should be public not private. This insistence on the public context is the most important point in Wittgenstein's theories. He did not believe, though, that theories should necessarily be statable in propositions. Other philosophers have backed Wittgenstein's opposition to Descartes.
Even those philosophers may actually be making the same kind of mistake as Descartes, the same fundamental mistake as Descartes, if Wittgenstein is right, because they too may be saying that the sentence "I am in pain" reports a particular fact, is a claim about what is the case, and needs to be understood in those terms, and then what they're trying to do is to understand it in those terms and trying to determine what kind of thing pain is. And because for one reason or another they're dissatisfied with the traditional Cartesian picture, they come up with their own alternative account of what kind of thing pain is. But if Wittgenstein's right, those questions may be inappropriate in the first place. If we do think of the sentence "I am in pain" more in terms of the exclamation "ouch," we're going to be much less interested in raising those questions in the first place, if indeed we think they're legitimate questions at all. We're not going to be asking what kind of thing must pain be like in order for us to make the claims about pain that we do. We're going to be focusing much more on how the language of pain actually works when you say things like "it hurts" and "I'm in pain," and what the conditions are for counting as correctly using that little bit of language, so that modern day physicalists may be as guilty of a basic Cartesian error as Descartes himself was.
Hell is other people. Jean-Paul Sartre was a successful playwright and novelist as well as a philosopher. The influence of Heidegger can be seen in his first book, Being and Nothingness, published in 1943. Sartre believed that because we are conscious beings, we can make ourselves of our own free choice. The existence of free choice is a key element in Sartre's philosophy. In part 4 of Being and Nothingness, Sartre writes of the dangers of allowing one's freedom to be usurped by a supposedly stable world of things. The world of someone who does this is unstable and false.
He says things at that stage that sound very like determinism. He says that every act has a cause. And the real difficulty is to understand how he can say that and still be somebody who's supporting a kind of radical freedom for human beings. The point about claiming that every act has a cause is that he conceives of causes very, very differently from the determinist. For him, this notion of nothingness, once again, plays a very important role. If, for example, I go to the shop to buy some milk or something like that, the determinist is going to explain that action by saying that there are certain pre-existing objective facts and subjective motives, namely, the objective fact was that there was no milk in my fridge, and the subjective fact is that I want some milk, right? And these two somehow interact and produce the action. Sartre says, no, on the contrary, what causes my action is something that doesn't exist. Namely, it's what he calls an absence. And so, consequently, what causes you to go to the shop, in this case, is not the simple fact that there isn't milk in the fridge, but that the milk is absent. It's entirely different. And immediately, he's already got a conception of the cause of actions which is entirely at odds with determinism, because determinism wants to say that actions are caused by pre-existing states of the world and states of the person. Here we've got something being caused by something that doesn't exist, namely an absence.
One area of Sartre's philosophy they have acknowledged as brilliant is his concept of bad faith. Bad faith is how Sartre describes an individual's denial of their own freedom.
Modern versions of that attitude of bad faith, although this is a slightly controversial thing to say, might be thought to be the kind of increasing medicalization of all kinds of things, where people are inclined to say that, I don't know, everything from dyslexia to dyspraxia, as we now call clumsiness, to, I don't know, the SAD syndrome, seasonal affective depression, to things like, we're now told that caring too much for others is a kind of illness, where over and over again, every time you open a newspaper, you discover there's some new medical category. And really the point of the medical category is precisely to excuse the person from responsibility for his actions. Now, I don't want to make any blanket claims about such medical categories. But in many cases, I think that it really is the point and that Sartre would look at them and say, you're actually in bad faith. You are actually responsible for your behavior. Just stop making excuses for yourself.
Later in life, Sartre turned to Marxism. He felt that existentialism could show the relevance of Marxist concepts by interiorizing them. And what of the future? Perhaps we should end where we began, with the words of Aristotle. For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin, and first began, to philosophize. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in Stuttgart in 1770 and studied at the University of Tübingen. Much of his writing is complicated and is difficult both to understand and to expound. He published his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in 1817, and further expanded editions followed in 1827 and 1830. The Encyclopedia is a hugely ambitious work. Its aim is to take in the whole of reality, history, and knowledge in a systematic form.
Well, the Encyclopedia, published in 1830, the third edition, comes in 3 parts, in the end 3 books. First, it's called The Logic, and then A Philosophy of Nature, and A Philosophy of Mind or Spirit. And the idea all along.
As science advanced during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution changed the way people worked and organized their lives. It also changed the way they looked at the world. A new generation of philosophers soon began to challenge Kant's theories. Whilst they accepted the idealism, they were dissatisfied with the limits he put on understanding and reason, and so sought to transform his idealism.
I think is to develop a system of a way of thinking that will resolve problems in the natural world, in the way science treats the world, and in the human world, politically and ethically and so on, by using the categories that he set out in the Logic.
There is much in the Encyclopedia that is influenced by Aristotle. Hegel was both a rationalist and a romantic. He had a keen sense of how the past affects the present. He claimed to have produced a complete map of all possible knowledge and reality. Hegel saw medieval Christianity as a prime example of what he called the unhappy consciousness. Judaism emphasized the separation between man and God. Christianity sought to unite man and God through the incarnation. Yet there is still a gap between the changing nature of the world and the unchanging nature of God.
He wants to integrate religion within philosophy. And the way he does it is to argue that basically the insights of religion are the same as the insights of philosophy, but just expressed or understood in religious terms. So he characterizes
and what he calls spirit, while contrasting the ancient world with the modern world.
What he means by spirit is a particular way in which consciousness, the consciousness of a people or a community or a period, is then at home in the world. So he talks, for example, about the Greeks as ever-present spirit. And the reason he talks about the Greeks there is that he has a picture of the Greeks as having this integrated view of the world, at home in the world, such that they didn't seem to suffer from the various problems and tensions of the modern world. So spirit, what he calls spirit, was realized in some sense with the Greeks, was apparent in the Greeks, because they had this kind of unity with the world. Hegel's view is that for a variety of reasons, that at-homeness, that spirit and that period was lost. And that's really because he tends to treat the Greeks as a kind of childhood of human consciousness. So much like a child has a certain kind of, as picture thinking, thinking in terms of images or representations. So religion will talk about God, and will talk about the incarnation, will talk about creation and so on. And he thinks they're all legitimate ways of thinking about the world in a pictorial or story form. And philosophy is able to recast those ideas in more philosophical forms. So, for example, religion talks about the incarnation, or religion talks about creation as God creating the world. Well, what does that mean philosophically? Well, it means that there's a sort of rational structure inherent in things. And when we talk about God creating the world, we just mean, in the sort of Einstein phrase, God doesn't play dice. Well, what does that mean? Well, we just mean that the world has a rational order. It's no accident, in some sense, that things, broadly speaking, are as they are. We can understand why things have to be a certain way. And that relates to the religious idea of God and God's creation and so on. So Hegel hoped that he could satisfy or give a place for religion in that way within a philosophical framework.
Hegel goes on to deal with reason